The snow fell in heavy, deliberate waves, muffling the world in a smothering quilt of white. Jenna watched from her picture window, her breath fogging the cold pane as the neighborhood seemed to dissolve into an eerie silence. She had always loved Christmas Eve for its magic, but tonight felt different, a little darker, a little wrong. Across the street, a single red Christmas bulb flickered erratically on the Bailey's porch, casting strange, uneven shadows against their home. Rows of houses, normally festive with lights and plastic reindeer, had gone dark early, as if the entire neighborhood was holding its breath. The only sound was the faint, persistent creak of something swinging in the distance. It wasn't the wind, though. There was no wind. An hour later, Jenna's unease deepened when she received a knock at the door. Not the friendly, hurried knock of carolers or neighbors dropping by, but slow, deliberate. She hesitated, peering through the peephole, but there was nothing. Just an empty porch blanketed with untouched snow. No footprints, no signs of life. The knock came again, three loud, almost mechanical raps this time, and her stomach turned. She cracked the door open an inch, and the cold rushed in like a warning. On the doorstep lay a small wooden box, crudely wrapped in aged twine. Against her better judgment, she picked it up. Its weight and chill seemed out of proportion, its contents shifting subtly. Inside, she found a single note scrawled in jagged red ink, "Naughty." At once, the flickering light from the Bailey's porch went dark, and the house across the street disappeared into complete blackness. She tried to call her husband, who was working the late shift at the hospital, but the phone was dead. Even her cell had no service, a strange void in an otherwise suburban area. Jenna locked all the doors, her pulse racing. The constant creaking sound grew louder, sharper, and seemed to circle her house. Upstairs, something shifted, a muffled thud and the faint sound of bells. Her son Tyler was asleep in his room, and she rushed upstairs, her bare feet silent against the carpet. His room was empty. The window, slightly ajar, let in a freezing draft that carried with it the faint smell of pine and something metallic. A shadow moved outside, a hulking figure that didn't belong to any man she'd ever seen. It stood at the edge of the yard, its figure barely discernible in the swirling snow. Then it raised an arm, pointing straight at Jenna's window. When she turned, her son was back in his bed, curled up as if he'd never been gone. But his room felt colder, darker, wrong. She leaned down to wake him, whispering his name, but he didn't stir. That was when she saw the same note on his nightstand, the blackened edges of the paper curling as if burned. Naughty. Her legs wouldn't move, her breath caught in her throat as the faint sound of bells returned, closer now inside the house. She could smell it again, the metallic tang, the rot masked by winter's crisp bite. The creaking noise reached the stairs, deliberate and heavy. In her growing panic, all she could do was glance out of the window one last time. The figure was gone, but in its place, fresh marks streaked the snow. Not the deep indentations of boots, but long, jagged grooves, like the chaotic tracks of something being dragged away. The snow-covered neighborhood of Maple Ridge always seemed idyllic during the holidays, with its neatly strung lights, glowing inflatables, and wreath-covered doors. But as dusk fell on Christmas Eve, a strange stillness crept through the cul-de-sac, as though the houses were holding their breath. Ellie, 10 years old and burdened with a curious mind, pressed her nose to the frosted glass of her bedroom window. Across the street, the Cleary House's festive lights had been turned off, leaving the property shrouded in unnatural darkness. For the past week, neighbors spoke in hushed murmurs about the Clearys, that they claimed to hear someone or something walking inside their attic at night. It was dismissed as squirrels or an overactive furnace, but now Ellie's heart raced as she stared out at the shadowy house. Beyond her reflection on the window pane, she swore she saw movement, a brief but deliberate flash of something tall through the Cleary's second-story window. Dinner passed with the usual clamor of holiday chatter and the scent of cinnamon candles filling the air. Ellie tried to focus on her plate, but her mind was tangled with fear and curiosity. She vaguely heard her father say something about heading to bed early, but she caught her mother's tone turn sharp whispering not to perpetuate silly neighborhood stories. Kneeling by her window again, Ellie strained her eyes on the Cleary house, now nothing more than a black void in the night. Minutes turned into an hour while sleet clawed at the walls of the house. And while she battled her growing fatigue, she saw it. Clad in what looked like tattered, old-world garb, a figure stepped into view on the Cleary's driveway. Dripping wet and ghostly pale, the figure clutched a sack that squirmed unnaturally, as though something alive was caught inside. Ellie stumbled backward instinctively, her heart hammering endlessly as she swore she heard bells jingling faintly in the wind. Hours later, the silence of the house was broken when Ellie awoke suddenly to a distant scraping sound, faint yet deliberate. She hadn't imagined what she saw, she was sure now, and something was moving near the bottom floor of her own house. Her breath caught, recalling the weight of the strange figure in its sack. Quietly slipping out of her room with trembling hands, she peered down the stairwell where faint shadows danced in the dim light filtering through the living room garlands. At first it was just the sound of steps, soft as whispers. Then came the distinct metallic jingle. Head pounding, Ellie dared a step lower, gripping the railing when she saw a faint figure, taller than her father, impossibly thin, shifting just out of view. Sweating now, she fought the instinct to cry out and stumbled backwards, her heel catching one of her mother's forgotten ornaments. The soft chime it gave off echoed louder than it should have, and whatever was in the living room stopped moving entirely. The morning buzzed with forced cheer, stockings overflowing and torn wrapping paper littering the carpet. Ellie sat curled on the couch, pale and withdrawn, as the warmth of Christmas Day unfolded obliviously around her. She hadn't slept, not after what she'd seen once it turned toward her. Hollow eyes that dripped crimson, a face stretched into an unnatural approximation of a grin that split its angular cheeks. And then there had been the voice, a voice without tone, guttural yet wordless, calling only to her. Her parents' insistence it was just a dream barely kept the tremor in her hands at bay. When she finally left the couch to grab cocoa from the kitchen, she froze, her breath catching as her gaze landed on the chimney's hearth. Lying just below the firewood on the brick ledge was a tiny, hand-hewn wooden doll with crudely painted eyes and a grin that stretched too far. Attached to it was a small note written in jerky, scratching script. Good children always see first.
The snow had been falling steadily for hours, layering the suburban streets in a pristine blanket of white. The houses on Sycamore Lane were strung with lights that blinked methodically, their cheeriness exaggerated against the still black sky above. Inside one of the homes, Margaret Jenkins sat alone in her meticulously decorated living room. The space was immaculate, almost unsettlingly so, with tinsel wrapped deliberately around banisters and ornaments hung at precise intervals on the tree. Margaret had always been known for her perfectionism, the kind that edged into obsession. Her husband was working late as usual, and her teenage son was at a Christmas party across town, and she told herself she liked the solitude, but somewhere deep down a knot of unease was forming. Despite the season's forced comfort, somewhere outside the wind picked up, whistling faintly through the gaps in the window panes, and she swore she heard something else, something faint. Earlier that week, the letters had started arriving. Small, crisply folded bits of parchment tucked into her doorframe or scattered on her front porch among the falling snow. Margaret assumed they were part of some neighborhood prank, the kind of thing bored kids concocted during winter break when the thrill of freedom became monotonous. The notes were written in elegant but spidery handwriting, with phrases that seemed random at first glance. He sees you when you're sleeping. The red suit is watching. Bad kids get something worse than coal. She had flicked them into the trash without a second thought, stuffing her unease down of every chore on her endless to-do list. Tonight, however, her meticulous nature was failing her. Her eyes kept flicking to the front window, catching glimpses of shadows in the shimmering holiday lights. Maybe it was the storm bending trees or the guilt gnawing at her for snapping at her son that morning. Whatever it was, Margaret found herself glancing at the door with increasing frequency, each creak and groan of the house sharpening her awareness. A sudden thump startled her. It came from the roof. Margaret froze mid-breath, waiting, her pulse a drumbeat against her temples. It had to be snow sliding, Or a bird. Did birds fly in snowstorms? She couldn't remember. Her husband always teased her about her overactive imagination, calling her paranoia creative but absurd. Gathering her resolve, Margaret stood and moved to the window, her reflection distorting in the frost-speckled glass. She squinted out at the yard but saw only the vague outline of her son's abandoned sled, half buried near the driveway, and dim lights from neighboring houses glowing through the snow. But the thump came again, louder this time, shifting directly over her. An icy dread dripped down her spine. She couldn't bring herself to investigate further, reminded instead of those chilling letters, those words she'd tried to forget. Bad kids get something worse than coal. At 11:43 p.m. sharp, Margaret's doorbell rang. The sound reverberated through the house like a scream, completely out of sync with the controlled peace of the night. She hesitated, walking slowly to the hallway. Her throat was dry, her hand cold and trembling as it hovered near the doorknob. Through the etched glass panels, she could make out the unmistakable red of someone's coat, vibrant even in the dim glow of the porch lights. Panic seized her. The doorbell rang again, a measured, deliberate tone that suggested too much patience. Against her better judgment, she peeked through the peephole, her breath hitching. The figure wasn't Santa, though it was dressed like him, red suit, white fur trim. But the face beneath the drooping hat bore an eerie mask, stretched into a broad, rictus grin. The eyes were hollow black pits, staring unblinking at her door. The figure carried a sack slung over one shoulder, but something about the way it hung, lumpy and uneven, made Margaret backpedal instinctively, her legs nearly giving out beneath her. Margaret turned to run, to hide, to do anything but stand frozen in place, but she hadn't even moved before the door creaked open of its own accord. The air rushed in, icy cold and smelling faintly of pine and decay. She stared, her every nerve ending ablaze with primal fear. Nobody was there. The porch stood empty, no footprints in the freshly fallen snow, no sign of the figure she'd clearly seen. But the sack was there now, nestled at her feet. It was surprisingly small, but moved faintly, almost imperceptibly, as though something inside were struggling for breath. Her mind spiraled, every rational thought drowned beneath a rising tide of dread. Shaking, she crouched down, hesitant fingers brushing the rough burlap. As the sack quivered once more, her resolve broke. She tore it open as a muffled whimper reached her ears. Inside was her son's favorite scarf, its deep green fabric soaked in something dark and sticky. Margaret's screams echoed through the empty streets of Sycamore Lane, her silence broken just as the neighbors' holiday lights flickered and went dark.